I see here the value of a PowerPoint. You don't have to stare at somebody sitting here in a chair, not in reality, and in a photograph or whatever we call that. So we've come to the last day, and looking at this, it was assigned as a close run thing. It came for a vote on July the 2nd. It had already been, the declaration, that is, had already been vetted by the committee. The committee had made mostly verbal changes, nothing really substantial. And then in the vote on July 2nd, there was still strong opposition to voting for independence from some members of the Continental Congress. And in the course of those debates, they did away with some very significant parts of Jefferson's original draft, most notably, that related to the slave trade and its evil. And that was removed. And even so, there were still individuals who voted no. John Dickinson, holding out, was, I think, one of the last speakers. And he argued as best he could that, no, we don't want to declare independence now. We need to wait. We need to have foreign allies. We need to be fully organized. And when it was clear that the vote was going to go against him, he resigned and left the chamber. And Pennsylvania voted for independence. And this affected South Carolina also. Edward Rutledge was still for delay, but the votes, when they finally came, it was only New York abstaining, and it was otherwise unanimous. So on July 2nd, the Declaration of Independence was adopted. They then spent another 2 days making revisions for having it printed. And it was printed by Samuel Dunlap, who had a newspaper in Philadelphia, and who is himself quite an interesting man. Unfortunately, I decided against using the National Archives thing on Dunlap because it just ran on and on and on. The actor was given more time than anybody else, and he was talking all about his own life and how he developed as a printer and so on. And but he's an interesting character because he was from Strabane in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, and came over. He was trained as a printer in Strabane. It's not a very big place, but it apparently had a newspaper. And he came over at the aegis of his uncle, Samuel Carson. Samuel Carson was a very large merchant in Philadelphia and had a major role in the flaxseed trade with Ireland. And so he said, come over here and we'll set you up as a printer. So he became a printer, and then he ran probably what was the radical newspaper in Philadelphia. And Carson had another branch with another nephew, Sam Carson, and that was in Baltimore. So there was an influential family of Scotch-Irish folk. So, but he just told you that at such torturous detail, I thought, well, we'll skip it. But he was only prepared to print when they had a final version all set up and he could just go across and this is the layout and so on. So on July the 4th, they had the solemn signing of this document, which was essentially prepared for Dunlap to print. And it was printed and sent out through the colonies. And on July 9th, it took what, 5 days, a whole week. Yeah. My math isn't very good, but that's a week. All right. So it took a whole week to get it to most other parts of the colonies, where it was solemnly read in public on July the 9th. And on July the 9th, when in what is now City Hall Park in Manhattan, they were reading the Declaration of Independence to an assembled crowd, Sir William Howe was landing British troops on Staten Island. And a little bit later, they moved over their huge force of British and Hessian troops were moved over to Brooklyn, the other side, and they were set up then to meet Washington. Washington had pretty well evacuated both Staten Island and Long Island, but he was concentrating on Manhattan, and he had a very small force of Continentals and a lot of Connecticut militia, and they were sending out efforts to get the various Continental regiments that were proposed but hadn't necessarily been put together. So in Pennsylvania, they created what they called the flying camp. And it was more or less volunteer militia who rushed to New York to meet this tremendous British onslaught. There were also a lot of Maryland and Delaware Continentals who, even though they were somewhat inchoate regiments, they were all marched up there. And they were strengthening Washington. So let me just carry that scenario through into August. In August, the now strengthened American Army, Patriot Army, moved over and held a series of hills in what is now Brooklyn, or the borough of Kings, and borough of Brooklyn, I guess, is Kings County. And so they were lined up to face the British, who held some parts of what would now be Brooklyn already because they'd moved over earlier. And then in the end of August, Sir William Howe ordered a very interesting maneuver. The ridge of hills, with the American Army very strong in one part of it, it petered out as you got further south in Brooklyn. And so at the last pass, it was guarded only by a force of Long Island militia. And so Howe said, let's use that pass and swing around behind the Americans so we can attack them from two sides. And the Long Island militia more or less disappeared before the British Army was marching through. They did it all in the middle of the night, silence, no word, and so on. And the next morning, August 27th, they closed the trap, so to speak, and the Americans were very badly defeated in what's now called the Battle of Brooklyn. It used to be called the Battle of Long Island. And so Washington was effectively trapped for the first time, but they managed with a regiment from Massachusetts that was recruited primarily from fishing ports. They managed to get boats, rowboats, and whatnot to evacuate the army as best they could. They had a lot of casualties, a lot of men captured as well as killed and wounded, but they managed to get, with John Glover at the helm there, they got the army over to Manhattan. And then they were retreating up Manhattan Island because they knew the British would. I mean, if you know New York, the East River is hardly a major barrier that you couldn't get an army across there. So at the last minute, a Dutch resident who saw what was happening sent his African servant to tell the British what's going on. And the good Dutch men forgot that his servant did not actually speak English. So the poor man came to the British sentries and tried to make them understand that he was speaking Dutch and nobody spoke Dutch. So they didn't get the word, so the Americans escaped. And they concentrated on the northern part of Manhattan Island at what was called, and still is, Fort Washington. And they were going to hold there. There had been some skirmishes because the British were right on their heels. There had been some skirmishes going up the island. The famous story of Lindley Murray, who was a Quaker merchant, and his wife entertained Howe and his staff as they were moving up, and in Murray Hill in Manhattan, and while Howe and his other officers were having tea, the Americans were scooting up the island, and the British Army column had halted to await the general and so on coming out again. So Washington again escaped there, and the British landed subsequently in what is now the Bronx at Throgs Neck and swung around. And by November, having defeated Washington again at White Plains in Westchester County, they swung down to trap them in Manhattan and the lower part of Westchester. Once again, Washington was able to get most of his forces across to the Jersey side. And in that, he had to leave the garrison at Fort Washington. The British attacked Fort Washington. It was a very large garrison and a very significant part of his army. Why he didn't just evacuate them, we don't know. But the British captured the entire American force. They had so many prisoners, they had to put them on some of the ships that had brought supplies and so on. So you had in Wallabout Bay off Brooklyn, you had all these ships tied up that had prisoners inside them. And then the next step was the British were chasing the American army across New Jersey, and they fell back on the Delaware and Pennsylvania. They had pretty well lost New York and New Jersey without anything that looked like a victory. So by the end of 1776, it seemed that independence was a chimera, that we had thought in July, oh, we could be an independent nation. Well, it looks like the British are just beating us from one spot to another. And part of the British force or the British plan was that Sir William Howe and his brother, Admiral Howe, were appointed as negotiators to arrange a peace with the now independent Americans. And they met in September, and nothing really came of it. It was too late. So this is why it was a close thing. It looked like we really wouldn't make it. Now, in that time, the reason I'm giving you all that military detail is, it's a really bleak time, but in that time, various states were making new constitutions. What will independence mean if we're going to be an independent country? What kind of a country will we be? And at this point, it is still the United States of America, or as they previously had been, the United Colonies, took a plural verb. It was not the United States of America is, it was the United States of America are. They were still 13 quasi-independent states, so they were making their own rules. And that was what I wanted to play with today, because they're quite interesting. What is it we were trying to do? One of the first of the new constitutions was Pennsylvania. And we mentioned that the last time, that Pennsylvania came up with a constitution that not only abolished the office of governor and replaced it by a committee. They did not trust any one person. They wanted several people as the executive council. And the assembly, the old assembly and the former council, which was the upper house of the assembly, were abolished and replaced by one legislative body. And there was a great deal of objection to that particular change. There is a man named, I'm trying to think of his first name, but he was MacMaster, and I forget what his first name was. I'm sorry, but he came from Hanover, which had previously been McAllister Town in Adams County, around where Gettysburg is, and he had been with the flying camp. He had been a colonel of Pennsylvania's hastily assembled force. He had a very fine record fighting with Washington across New Jersey and so on. So he was certainly a deep-dyed patriot, but he has a lot of letters and so on in the aftermath of the getting the Constitution together, saying that how could we possibly recognize these people as the representatives of the people of Pennsylvania because they were not elected. He believed that the old assembly, whatever rights or wrongs they had about them, they were elected. And now you simply transferred the old provincial Congress and said, okay, we're now the legislature. But there was going to be an election in November to confirm the new Constitution. And that new Constitution, and this is something that runs through, the reason I'm sort of berating all this is that what kind of a country did these people want? It was if they now had an independence, and influenced greatly by George Mason's Virginia Constitution and the Declaration of Rights. They almost every one of them rattled off a whole series of rights that should be preserved. And in Pennsylvania, they wanted the absolute separation of the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. They wanted the common law to continue to be recognized. This was also true in Virginia, where as soon as they had adopted the new Constitution in June 1776, they appointed a committee, Jefferson was on it, Mason was on it, to revise the laws. And they agreed at their very first meeting that the only changes they would make would be grammatical and changes that would clarify what the existing law said. They were not about to create some new law book. They rather liked the way things were at the present. So this is a good system, even though we have now broken away from Britain. And Pennsylvania was very much in that line. Pennsylvania also had, which is understandable given its history, had the broadest freedom of religion of any one of the new constitutions. It didn't matter what religion you were entitled to practice it in Pennsylvania. And other colonies changed that considerably, limited. This is why you never try to work from notes, because you can't read them easily. All right. So, but that was Pennsylvania. Then Delaware came in very quickly. They abolished, like Pennsylvania, the bicameral legislature, and it was replaced by an assembly and a privy council, very much like Pennsylvania. And they wanted, because they were very specific on this, no established church, which is what ultimately gets into our Bill of Rights, that it isn't so much that you have an absolute freedom as that there is no establishment. Maryland adopted their constitution in November 1776. And here, they again wanted the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary to be absolutely distinct and free from one another. So they would probably have opposed some of the things that are happening in the United States now. They listed a whole series, which of course was in the Virginia Declaration also, a whole series of legal rights for trial, that you should be tried by a jury of your peers in the location. You should be able to face your accuser. You were supposed to know what the charges were immediately, and so on. And that recurs in quite a few other of these. And then this is the first one that makes a lot about this, although it was in the Declaration as Jefferson wrote it. And that is borrowing from the British 1689 documents and so on, and obviously giving you the meaning of the Second Amendment when it was adopted in 1789 or 1791. I'm sorry, is that we want a well-regulated militia, but no standing army in times of peace. So they borrowed that from England, and more directly from Mason and the others, and from the Declaration itself, that we did not want a standing army. That was always considered in Britain a danger to have a standing army. And at the same time, they gave all persons paying taxes the right to vote. So you no longer had a limitation. Of course, it was a limitation because not everybody owned sufficient property to pay taxes. And so that was decided there. Maryland gave to the first one of these that was specific, gave to Dunkers, Mennonists, and Quakers the right to affirm rather than swear, that you could simply affirm that I will tell the truth, because all three of them, the Dunkers are the Church of the Brethren, the Mennonists are the Mennonites, they all objected to taking oaths, so that was to be allowed. There was also, in the Maryland Constitution, an absolute liberty of the press. That was very important. And that, of course, was in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and it was being adopted by the other colonies. And one more thing in Maryland. Maryland was the colony that had the strictest definition of religious liberty. That you remember, well, actually maybe you don't, But when Mason's declaration in its original form was presented in Virginia, it said that because a man's relationship with his creator is basically his own business, therefore the widest toleration should be given. And James Madison said, no, toleration implies that the Anglicans who are established in Virginia are the norm, but we'll put up with these Presbyterians and Quakers and whatnot. And so he had that changed. So it said very clearly that the fullest liberty of conscience is appropriate rather than a toleration. Now, Maryland went the other way. Maryland said that we believe, that you should have freedom of religion, but they define it as anyone who believes in one God and in the truths of the Old and New Testament. So it essentially said you had to be a Christian to be tolerated in Maryland. And it wasn't until 1834 that there was a full rights of Jewish people in Maryland to be elected to office, to and so on. So it was a strange business there. Oh, I forgot a couple of things on the Pennsylvania one. The Pennsylvania is the one that phrases it, not talking about well-regulated militia only, but the right to bear arms, but no standing army. And they also gave rather interesting right, which I don't think any other state constitution did. And that was the right to emigrate. That you could move out of Pennsylvania, you didn't have to stay there. And equally, if you wanted to move into Pennsylvania, there shouldn't be any barrier. So Pennsylvania wanted open borders. Wherever you were coming from, you would be tolerated there. And they had all those good things. And North Carolina had already adopted its constitution, and has South Carolina. And the South Carolina one, which was in March 1776, apart from the peculiarity of abolishing the role of governor and having a president and a vice president of South Carolina, it was all taken up with organizing the military force. So it wasn't a real constitution. It was a ad hoc kind of document. And so that was it. So we come into the end of 1776 and swinging back into how events were moving. At the very end of the year, after all the defeats in New York and being chased across New Jersey, Washington called for the Pennsylvania militia to organize and to meet him on the Delaware. He was evacuated into Pennsylvania. And when the call came, I think it was Bucks County, which is on the Delaware River. The total force that arrived to help Washington consisted of the county lieutenant, the commander of all the local militia, another officer, and a ragtag of about 35 men. The militiamen said, "Are you crazy? We're not going to go out to fight." And that was true across Pennsylvania. That people were getting, and everywhere, people were giving up. It was great to declare independence, but it's going to be all over. And it's at that time that that Washington is quoted. An officer on his staff wrote the quotation. It isn't anything Washington wrote, that if I am totally defeated here, I will retire to Augusta County in Virginia and there make a stand. So Washington was prepared at the end of 1776 that it was going to be all over. And there is a reason why there is a painting in the Capitol in Washington made in the 18th century by John Trumbull, showing a man, Washington himself, standing up in a rowboat, and people are rowing the boat across the Delaware, because on Christmas Day, 1776, Washington crossed the Delaware and attacked a Hessian outpost at Trenton, and totally defeated them. And his little army then marched on to Princeton, where they took on the British outposts. They were all sort of dug in for winter quarters. And on January 1st, 1777, defeated them. So it took until Trenton 6 months or 5 months of defeat for it be possible to say, yes, the Declaration of Independence stands, and we are going to be an independent country. So that's how it was indeed a close run thing. So that's enough for me. Let's hear from you.
Comments or questions? Okay, so let's thank Richard for a wonderful course.
Thank you, Richard. That was informative to amazing depth, as most have ever heard. I'm wondering when the Articles of Confederation, which was a way of trying to resolve some of the issues you've been raising, when did that start? Come into effect, and how did it differ from what we had?
They began working on the articles in 1777, and they were not complete. They were never really complete. The committee was still playing with additional things, but it was sufficient to say that we had now created a unified country with autonomous or quasi-autonomous states. but that we had met that one of Richard Henry Lee's resolutions presented in June 1776, that we would be fully organized as a united country. And the articles were imperfect, but they were what you had to do. It's like everything, there's anything that has to be done by a committee is always going to come out with, well, we put this in for these people, but it doesn't really balance with that. But it held the country together. And very significantly, Silas Deane, through 1776, had been a unrecognized, unofficial delegate to France to see what the French could do to help us. And the French did not. That was the other one of Richard Henry Lee's resolution. And the French were generous, but it had to be done sub rosa. It couldn't be done publicly until the defeat at Saratoga, when the army under Burgoyne had to surrender. And then the French said, yes, we'll come in. So it took effectively until 1778 for us to have publicly allies. And one could make the argument, it's been done by people, that the Americans didn't win the American Revolution. The French army did. So anyway.
Other comments or questions? Well, I had a question particularly about the state constitution's religious tests for office. And you addressed that to a certain degree. Of course, it runs counter to the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution. But, some of these tests were not just, only Christians, but Protestants or even sects of Protestants that were, given the authority to obtain office. And many of these requirements are actually still in some of these state constitutions. I mean, they're no longer taken seriously. But could you sort of explain the different environment at the state level and at the federal level that took sort of two different approaches to religious tests for office?
Well, I was going to say one thing that would color all of that in the first 50 years or so of the United States was that until 1832 in Connecticut and 1836 in Massachusetts, the individual, whatever religion or none you claimed, you had to pay to the support of the congregational ministry in your town. You had, in effect, an established church in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And so from their point of view, it was appropriate if you could, we could tolerate all these other people, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, that's Quakers, that's fine. But as long as they pay for the congregational church. And so that mentality would suggest that it makes sense to have various kinds of religious tests. And as I mentioned earlier, in Maryland, it took until the 1830s, and when Andy Jackson was president, to finally get the effectively bar to office holding by Jewish people. And, there was absolutely no reason for it, but it held on there for 60 years. And similarly with a lot. So I don't know that I have a very clear answer on that. It probably, well, I don't know. What do you think, Rick?
The federal constitution really has a different framework looking at the issue.
Yes. And then the Bill of Rights after that. But that attitude continued. And I suppose it's also colored by the fact that such a huge proportion of the people living here at that time were all connected, and many of them, not all of them by any means, but many of them actively with one Protestant group or another, so that it seems sort of normal to say, well, you ought to be somebody who believes in the Old and New Testament. Okay, fine, and so on. Another one that sort of colors that also is that a New England Baptist, a very prominent man whose name I don't remember at the moment, was advocating, this is after the adoption of the Constitution, that the Congress publish an official authorized Bible. Well, it was going to be a Christian Bible, and the Congress should act on that and distribute it. And the Congress had the good sense not to do that. But that was that kind of mentality that, well, we're all Protestants, so the Catholics, they're all right. They can have their church and all. But Paul has something to say.
It was the late 19th century, and I understood it was around the 1870s before Catholics could hold office in Massachusetts, and that there was discrimination even today with atheists. There are still 5 states that will not let an atheist run for public office. Tennessee, I believe, is one of them. And I think of the Bible being printed. Isn't it Oklahoma that has just printed the Trump Bible, and that's to be circulated in all of the schools and colleges? So we're not dead with that issue yet in many aspects of it. Rhode Island, I believe, had the first synagogue in America. And they'd had one in Barbados before that, where many of them had come from.
Was the process modeled elsewhere, that is, with a Declaration and then a Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Did that become the model for other, clearly into the 19th century, there's a number of revolutions and, French revolutions, and did it become a model for them to put together their government?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. It was the American documents went around the world. Rick was wanted to share with me an article from the Washington Post that said just that, the American Revolution and the documents it created had a worldwide effect, not always successful, but the ideas that were in there, it was hard to put them back into a bottle. So, good.
The communication structure was used. I mean, did other countries use the same structure of the declaration? Did it? No.
Other comments or questions?
During the French Revolution, you may be surprised to learn that Robespierre, the terrible Robespierre, freed all the slaves in all of the French colonies, including Haiti, which Napoleon took over. He sent the best of his troops to put down, and that was the terrible massacres of the Haitian Revolution as a consequence, really, of Robespierre saying all of the slaves in Haiti and anywhere else there's a French colony are free. So the arguments, I'm sure, that were put up during the discussion of our Constitution and were put up by people like Jefferson, who had been in France as an ambassador, had an impact upon the French Revolution, at least certainly with respect to that concept.